Hi and welcome back. This is Lecture 5. Up to this point, we've introduced to learning. We've talked about a learning approach that we call learning journals. We have talked about how to read before you come to class, what I call stage 1 of learning journals. We've talked about how to take notes during class. That's that information that's either match information or new information. And we've talked about exam preparation and issues of test anxiety and the like. Now what we're going to do is turn to what for many students is another major academic deficiency or weakness, writing. I'd like to talk in this lecture for a few minutes about how I see most students when they come to me as writers, the kinds of things they do naturally. And then after I have outlined that, I will ask you to maybe consider how much what I say parallels your own academic approach to writing. Then I want to talk about an approach that for me and for many of my students does seem to work for them, what we call jam writing. And I will outline jam writing. I will give you some actual examples of jam writing. And then we'll talk about ways that you can use jam writing in your academic life. And then finally, I will talk about informal writing, as I call it. And I will define informal writing, and I'll give you some idea of how to improve some of the types of informal writing that you have to do. For those of you who are wanting more information on academic writing, and more especially the academic essay, you're going to have to wait one lecture. We'll pick that up in the next lecture, and we will see these two lectures then as coming together. Okay? Let's talk for a few seconds about how most students write. I can tell you a little story that sets this up nicely. I began doing lecturing and thinking about writing years ago. And as part of that work, I went to middle schools where I would ask students to write for a period of time on their favorite animal. They were, I believe, 7th graders at the time. My interest was not what they said. My interest at the time was more how they approached their writing. Several things happened in every class. First of all, there would be long pause of silence. Someone would start maybe tapping on their pen top, or they would begin to tap on their table. Finally, one student would begin writing. And they would begin at the top of the page, and they would begin to write for a few minutes, when all of a sudden their pen would stop, their eyes would go back up to the top of the page, they would begin to read what they had written, and then they would tear their paper out of their spiral notebook, wad it up, put it on the paper, and they would be back to a white page again with more sighing. Sighing was always kind of an indicator that there was some frustration. I did this for a while, and then I came to a high school writing class of seniors. And I, on the first day of class, walked in and said, "Hi, I'd like for you to write an essay for me briefly on a place you would rather be than here right now." And I thought, this is a simple enough assignment. And I sat down at my desk, and I sat down to write myself. There was a moment of silence. And then from the back of the room, I heard a sigh. And then someone started with pens. And then there was tapping. And within 20 seconds, someone had gone, and I thought, wow, they do it here too. As I've told this story, and I've told it all over the world, and interestingly, I get writing teachers from all over the world, Korea, Japan, all over the world, who say, wow, that's exactly what our students do as well. I think that what happens for most students is that they will start writing, and then I have found that most students stop between the 4th and the 7th line. They're always trying to edit while they write. Now, I think there's a reason for this, and it's what I call the English lie. The English lie is the reason most students stop writing and then go back up to the top of the page and begin to read what it is that they have already written. The English lie is simply, good writing is good grammar. When I, for example, stop a student and I say to them, now why exactly is it that you stopped right then and your eyes went back up to the top of the page? They will look at me as if something's wrong with me, and they will say, I have to get it right. And I ask them, what does that mean, you have to get it right? And they will say, well, you know, I have to get it right so that the teacher will give me a good grade, etc., etc. Good writing is good grammar. The idea that if I somehow can write grammatically correct material, then I will be writing well. It's not true. To prove that writing and editing are in fact two completely different functions, I would recommend this little game. And by the way, you can play this with your friends if you want to. Set someone down. And you can, after I say this, if you want to, turn off the tape and try it yourself to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate. Set someone down and say to them, I would like to do an experiment with you. I want you to write for a while. I'm going to give you a topic, and I want you to write for a while. And when you get to the 5th line, I want you to keep writing. But I'm going to ask you to begin to read out loud what you wrote on the 1st line. Okay? In other words, you're going to begin to write, and then when you get to the 5th line, I want you simultaneously to begin to read out loud what you wrote on the 1st line. Are you ready? Go. And then give an assignment, a topic, a place you'd rather be other than here right now. When they get to the 5th line, ask them if they can read it out loud. You will notice that as remarkable as our minds are, this is a process, two processes together, we cannot do simultaneously. Reading and editing are one process. Writing is an entirely different process. And I think this is why so many students, the tearing out of the paper for me is a signal of major frustration. I think there's another reason why so many students are frustrated in their writing. Many students will go into class and the teacher will say, tonight I want you to go home and to write an essay. And so they go home, they sit down, they look at the paper looks back at them, or they look at the screen looks back at them, and they have to write an essay. Got to write an essay, got to write an essay, got to write an essay. And they try to come up with an essay. I have students, I will overhear them, they will say, I've got to come up with a poem tonight. I've got to come up with a story tonight. What I call this is moving from form to content. I believe it is a major mistake, and I believe it is why so many students struggle in their writing. Let me explain what I mean. Form simply means the type of writing that we're talking about. Essay, story, poem, play, whatever. Many students will begin from the form, and then they try to generate content or idea. And for them, it is majorly, majorly frustrating. Beginning with form is like way too difficult and frustrating, and therefore we are constantly saying things like, this sounds dumb, this sounds stupid. We will say things like, this doesn't look right. Many students will say that to me when they're tearing their paper out, and I'll ask them, wait a minute, why are you getting rid of that draft? It doesn't look right. Okay? Good writing is not good grammar. Good writing, I will define for you now as simply this. Good writing is a good idea. That's good writing, okay? And when we have a good idea, we know that we are onto something. So what we want to do, if you will, is to reverse the process. We will no longer want to write from form to content or idea. Rather, we will want to write from idea to form. Back to the reading and writing example. What would happen if we simply wrote and didn't worry about trying to edit? This is what I call jam writing. It's called lots of other things. You maybe have heard about it as free writing or flow writing. The idea is simply this. Once the pen or pencil starts, and of course you can do it typing as well, we don't stop to review or edit our work. The key, then, is whatever is in our brain goes on to the page. This idea is an interesting one, and it's one that quite a few authors, in fact, employ. Think about a couple of quotes. The great writer E.M. Forster said the following. Look at this quote. He said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" Which is an interesting which is an interesting quote. Look at this quote as well. Robert Frost said, "For me, the initial delight is in the surprise of remembering something I didn't know I knew." What we are doing when we jam write then is simply trying to get our ideas onto the page. Whatever is in our brain goes onto the page. If I don't know what I want to write about, that's what I say. It's important to understand jam writing then is only for you. No one else ever reads this. Solely for you. You have total freedom to be able to say anything you want to say. Of course, the other really important thing here can be best understood by a bizarre phenomenon that I notice occurs about all over the world. I'm driving along through the middle of where I live, they're called Badlands, the middle of nowhere, and I am alone, in the middle of the night, when all of a sudden my car breaks down. Just completely breaks down in the middle of the road. What do most people do? "Oh, this is just great. Now what am I going to do?" Get out, open up the hood. "Oh, what am I supposed to do now? What am I..." I've always often wanted to come up to someone and say, "To whom are you speaking? There's no one else here," right? But we know something. Children, when you watch them play and they're very young, they will talk all the time, right? Even though they're alone. "Okay, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to, oh, nope, that didn't work. Oh, I'm going to, right?" Children do this all the time. We know that as we get older, we internalize this kind of dialogue with ourselves, but it's still there. As a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of linguists who suggest that while you are listening to me right now, there's all kinds of stuff going through your head, dialogues, ideas, comments. Jam writing seeks to take all of that, as much of it as we can, and dump it down onto the page. We do not worry about form. We do not worry about grammar. We do not worry about usage issues. We simply put it onto the page. Okay, specifically now, how do we do jam writing? Once we start writing, our pen doesn't stop for at least 10 minutes. We can be reminded of the, for many of us anyway, the experience of middle school PE, when they took us out on the track and made us run the mile. And we started around the track, and halfway around we decided we were going to die, and so we needed to slow down. And the teacher said, "Keep going." And we ran for a little while longer, and then we for certain knew that we were going to fall over right there on the track, and our friends would all gather around and go, "Bummer." So we slowed down. And the coach or teacher said, "Keep running." But then something strange happened, and we hit what runners often call the second wind, and they just begin to kind of move in a group. And then you can run for quite some time. Good runners, of course, try to get there quickly. We will find the same thing occurring in jam writing. We will want to write beyond the 7th minute. In my studies with students, at about the 7th minute, most students are convinced they have said everything that they need or can say. And I will ask them to keep going. So when you do your jam writing, you're going to want to make sure that the pen doesn't stop for at least 10 minutes. One of the beauties of this is the ability to surprise yourself, okay? You will oftentimes say things beyond the 7th minute that you don't even know where it came from. It sounds very much like what Ian Forrester and what Frost were suggesting in their writing. You don't always know. You're not in total control in jam writing, which is one of the reasons that it's so much fun. We don't worry, as I said, about grammar or usage. We let go, we have fun. Let's try an introduction, shall we? We have heard what jam writing is. I would like for you in a moment to stop the tape. I'm going to give a topic. And there's really two types of jam writing. One is focused, the other is non-focused jam writing. And what I want you to do is to do what I call focused jam writing, which is writing on a specific topic. Unfocused jam writing is simply sitting down and writing anything and everything. Focused jam writing allows us to return back to the idea. I'd like you to sit and write for 10 minutes non-stop about the first time you can remember falling in love. Now, wait. Before you start going, "Oh, no, I don't." You got to write it. You don't say it out loud. Turn off the tape, have a sheet of paper in front of you, and whatever is in your brain goes on to the page. Whatever. and see if you can write non-stop for 10 minutes to make sure that you're not going to be cheating and it's truly jam writing. Take a piece of paper and cover line by line as you write. Go ahead, turn off the tape, and for 10 minutes write on the first time you can remember falling in love. Okay, how did you do? Did you do jam writing? Let's take a look at an example of jam writing. One of my students, Anna again, was gracious enough to allow for me to show an example of her jam writing on this very topic. She writes, as you will notice as you're looking at it now, she writes jam writing. Notice there's a couple of immediate types of giveaways. One, it's almost always completely or near completely illegible. You're writing as quickly as you can, and it's only for you. Two, notice as well that there are no paragraph breaks. No reason for it. All we're doing is simply writing. And here Anna is telling us about a time when in her youth when she fell in love for the first time with Tom Cruise in a movie that she saw of Tom Cruise. You will notice that if you were to read through this, and we won't take much more time with this, but if you were to read through this, you would notice that this is very personal and yet not worrying about any other kinds of issues, grammar, etc. Now, how specifically do we use this kind of writing? We will use jam writing to begin most of our paper writing. We will have a writing process that can be best represented through a flow chart. Once we have ideas from our jam writing, we can go back and read through them and begin to think about what certain ideas work for us. If we wanted to take the time, we could go back with Anna's piece of jam writing, and we could find one or two ideas that could then be turned into, a piece of poetry, could be used for a possible idea in a short story, could be used as an idea for an essay. So what we're really looking for in our jam writing is the idea. Once we find the idea, then we're ready to think about form. We will use, then, any number of pieces of jam writing. We don't have to just use one to try and hit on the idea. Once we have the idea, we can create any number of forms with the idea. In my room, in my classroom, we will oftentimes take several pieces of jam writing on a topic, and we will take the same idea, and we can create any number of types of form. Once I have an idea, the form component is much, much easier to do. Once we've decided, then we begin to move to draft one. Once we have draft one taken care of, we have typed it in manuscript style. Notice the graphic that I'm providing for you here called the writing flowchart. We begin with our ideas. We then will move to what oftentimes is called pre-writing. We will, for example, do any number of types of things. Webbing, jot listing, lots of ideas that you can learn in any kind of writing course. If those are ideas that we want to work with, we then create what we call a rough draft. We then ask the question, is this worth improving or even keeping? If it's not, we go back. If it is, then we go to the revision process. We'll have several different types of what we call writing conferences. We will peer edit. We will allow others to see it. We will group edit, maybe more than a single person at a time. And obviously, we will allow for the teacher to take a look at it. Finally, we will move then to the final copy and maybe even publishing our piece. Okay, this is an introduction to jam writing. We will see more of this in Lecture 8, where there we will actually observe a student who begins with some jam writing and an idea, and then over a period of 5 days creates a completion project at the end in the form of an academic paper. Okay? So if you have further questions about the outline that I just gave, you'll want to come back with me in the next lecture and then in the 8th lecture to understand better exactly how we do that. I want to talk about now, broadly speaking, 2 types of writing. When we talk about writing, I like to talk about formal versus informal writing. Some people like to use the term creative writing, but I don't like that term, because for me, all writing, if it's writing, is creative, because all writing is thought, and thought is creative. I don't really like to talk about creative writing as a certain type of writing. Instead, I will talk about informal versus formal writing. For the remainder of this lecture, what I want to do is to talk about informal writing, and then in the next lecture, I will talk about formal writing, okay? And as well, editing comments regarding formal writing, and informal as well. We speak of informal writing as that writing which has a broad audience, which might receive different comments, for example, depending upon who sees it. Let me give you an example. I had a student who wrote a poem in my class, and we sent that poem off to several different editors for potential publishing. One of the publishers wrote back and told her that it was one of the finest pieces that he had seen of a high school senior. Another editor wrote back and said that the poem was not worth any kind of publishing. Now, how do you account for the fact that the same work, the same poem, would have such varied responses? This is the nature of informal writing. Any type of writing, then, is informal if the intended audience is broad and the rules for the writing really do vary with audiences. We should try, when we are writing informal writing, to publish, because we want to experiment with our voice, and we would like to share our voice with others. It is a way for us to validate our voice, and I believe that we should try to publish. It also will provide us with incentive, reason to try and improve our writing. I want to talk now for a few minutes about the different types of informal writing that oftentimes we are either asked to write or maybe we want to write, okay? The first, obviously, I say obviously, most of the time when people think of informal writing, poetry does come to mind. Poetry is one of the more popular forms of informal writing. I want to suggest for those of you who would like to improve your poetry that you will do much better if you begin with a concrete image or picture in your mind. What is it that you wish to describe in detail? And see that picture or that image clearly, and begin actually in jam writing. Don't worry about the form of poetry. Many students who try to write a poem struggle because it doesn't look like a poem. Forget about how it looks, and simply sit down and jam write with as much detail as possible. The way I like to think about poetry is a snapshot or a picture. When the picture is fuzzy, we call that out of focus. In your mind, try to have as clear an image as you can, and then create that image with words. In other words, poetry is picture writing with words. And we want to create the most clear picture that we can. You can always come back after the fact, and you can always construct lines. Once you have the idea again, you can always worry about form. The second type of informal writing I want to talk about is fiction and drama. Obviously, really varied forms of informal writing. There are several ways, though, that writers like to approach their writing. Let me give you examples of a few. One approach is to begin with characterization. For example, you can write some what we call character sketches. Now, the idea here is that you begin by describing a character. You have no idea where this character will be in terms of the setting of the story, and you don't care. You have no idea what kinds of conflicts or fights will be involved for this character, and you don't care. But you have a very clear image in your mind of who this character is. What does this character look like, feel like, think like? And you describe so strongly that character that you can put that character in any number of settings, okay? Any number of situations or conflicts, and you can create storyline. Another way to begin or create ideas for stories, even in your jam writing, is to work from a scene. Now, my wife, if she was a writer, she would probably write this way, because she loves those long novels that are set in Ireland with the castles. Setting is very important to any novel that she reads. Oftentimes, we can play this game. Maybe you've played it before in class, where you all sit in a circle and the teacher says, come up with one really scary place and write it down on a piece of paper. And so you write down 4 or 5 lines of a really scary place, the best scary place you can imagine. And then everyone shifts their paper 1 seat to the left. You immediately look at the scary scene or setting that has been set up for you, and you have 10 minutes to construct a storyline. It is amazing to my students how simple it is for them to do this once they have a really scary setting all set up, and the stories just start to come to mind immediately. If you like setting, and you can see setting well, this might be a place for you to begin. A third and final place is the fight or the conflict. Good stories have always some kind of fight or conflict. Many students feel the need to create an original story. Well, the truth is, most of the storylines in terms of conflict have all been taken. But you can always take a conflict and vary it in some way. So while you're watching movies or watching television sitcoms, you can ask yourself, what's the primary fight in this? And how could I use this in a new story that maybe I would be creating? Informal essays involve any time that I write to voice an opinion for a potentially broad audience. Writing for the school newspaper, writing for a local paper, voicing an opinion of some kind or another. We want to always watch our thesis, what it is we're arguing, and how we prove that. And not always just simply write from our own pure emotions, but somehow try to validate our ideas. What I see in the next lecture about essay writing especially will help this understanding. Okay, finally, let's talk for a few minutes about suggestions for improving informal writing. If I really want to improve my poetry, or my short fiction writing, or my play writing, how exactly can I do that? Let me give a couple of suggestions in closing. First of all, I believe that we need models. We have to be readers if we're going to be writers. Every writer that I know, who I've ever spoken to about what exactly is it that you really recommend for the students that I teach, because I teach writing so much, every one of them will always say the same thing. They have to be readers if they're going to be writers. If you are going to write science fiction short stories, you need to find a model, Asimov, for example, and read that model. You have to know that model well. Think about what we do with music. When you get a brand new CD, do you go home, listen to it once, take it out of the CD player, snap it over your knee, throw it away? Only if it's really lousy, right? If it's a good CD, you listen to it over and over. But why? You've already heard it once. Well, it entertains me, maybe, is an answer. Right. We want to do the same thing with books. When we finish reading a book, we want to go back and read it again, and again, and again. See, this is what we do with good models. The other interesting thing, if you get a good CD, what's one of the first things you always want to do? Go to somebody and say, have you heard? Have you heard? See, we want to do the same thing with books as well. When we read a good book, why not go and share the book with someone and say, I read this great book. This is the value of group study, by the way. You can all share the kinds of books that you're reading. One other suggestion that I would like to make here in closing is a process that I call emulation. The idea here is that you find a poet or a fiction writer or a nonfiction writer who for you is the ideal. When you read them, you know that you're reading what you believe is about the best you've ever read. And you read them and study their writing quite a bit. Then you sit down and you try to emulate. Now, this is not imitate. They're not the same. You look at, for example, the way they approach subject. You look at maybe, for example, if your poet model is Whitman, maybe you really like the way that he plays around with lists, and you like that. And so you decide, I'm going to try to write a poem where I do some listing like that. One of the projects that we often do in my classroom is to take one fiction model, one poet model, one nonfiction model for the whole year. And our students, my students, will simply read those 3 people for an entire semester. What they find happening is they really do begin to understand just how the writer approaches their writing, and they can begin to emulate. Finally, just in closing, I want to suggest that there are a couple of ways to improve our short fiction and maybe even our novel writing for those of you out there who see that as a great goal. You want to focus on your use of dialogue, and you want to focus on the development of conflict or fight in the piece. That's going to be at the heart of all of your good short story or novel writing. You want your dialogue to be very real. Go into a bookstore and pick up any best-selling novel, open at random, and begin to read the dialogue, and you will notice it always sounds fresh and real, and that's the way that you want to write. Okay, we've introduced jam writing, and we've talked about moving from idea to form. Now, in the second of these two lectures on writing, in Lecture 6, I want to talk about formal essay writing. When a teacher gives you an essay at school to write on, what exactly is it they're asking you to do? Come back in a little bit and we'll talk about that. Hi, and welcome back. This is Lecture 6. Last lecture we talked about writing, and we talked about idea generation through jam writing, and we talked about informal writing. In this lecture I want to do two things. First, I want to talk about what I call formal writing, meaning here now specific writing for a specific audience, namely an instructor. And then I want to talk about the other part of writing, which is editing. Both informal stuff as well as formal stuff, okay? But first I want to make sure that we're all on board with the comments that I made in the last lecture. It is possible that maybe you didn't hear the last lecture, or it's always good to review. We said that we always want to move from content to form, which means that we're looking for ideas that we can use. We're writing in school the formal essay in a very prescribed way, okay? In other words, there are rules that are specific rules, if you will, anytime we're in class, okay? We also understand that any time that we're writing, we're kind of playing a game. And I like to teach students this way. We're playing a game. We say, this is the game. You can play the game well once you understand the rules. Does that make sense? Once you understand the rules, then you can play the game well. If you don't understand the rules, then you're frustrated, okay? Formal writing is a game. Once we understand the rules, we're able to play the game. And now I want to introduce formal writing to you. When we write for a single audience, with a single intent, we are doing what I call formal writing, as opposed to informal writing, as I discussed in the last lecture, which is for a broad audience. You'll remember the poem that I told you about, which was accepted by one publication, but denied by another. In formal writing, our audience is much more singular. We know specifically we're usually writing to an instructor. When we're writing in educational settings, or what we will call academic settings, then typically this is what we call the academic essay. Now this is important because we talked about informal essays in the last lecture, but when a history instructor asks me to write a paper, they are asking for something very specific. I told you it's a game we're playing. Unfortunately, often history instructors won't tell us what the rules for the game are. They will simply give our paper a C. And a student can grow extremely frustrated, never understanding, what is it, Mom, that this teacher is looking for? What we want to do for the next few minutes is talk about specifically the rules for the game. What is it that a teacher is looking for when he or she assigns a paper in school? Notice the assumption, first of all. The assumption is that the instructor is going to use the writing assignment as a way to understand if you understand or comprehend the concepts introduced. Okay? In class, therefore, we're really reading so that we can then respond, and our response most of the time is in writing. Now sometimes, of course, our response is an oral response. And a lot of teachers will have us write a paper and then read it aloud. That would, of course, be oral. Primarily, though, as you move in academics on up, the ladder, if you will, especially once you leave high school and begin to attend universities or colleges. More and more, instructors will ask you if you understand a concept through the formal essay. Okay? So it's important that you understand this is really what we're doing. In other words, we are writing to demonstrate comprehension. Or, let's use our word from first lecture, learning. Okay? We want to make sure then that any time we're writing a formal essay, we are showing, exhibiting our learning. Okay? I think that one of the more frustrating things for students is to know material, to understand material well. I showed a couple of exams early on in one of our lectures. A student oftentimes will come to the end of an examination and there's an essay-style question there, and they know the answer, but they are not totally certain how to provide the answer. And because that frustration is there, their grade sometimes is damaged. We want to be able to know specifically the format of a formal essay so that we understand when an instructor says, write an essay on X, that we understand exactly what it is they're asking us to do. Broadly speaking, there are two things that make a formal essay a formal essay. Let me give them both to you, and then I want to explain them in detail. The first is, we are always looking for a thesis. The second is, we are always looking for some kind of an explanation, or I will use the word validation of a thesis. Okay? Those are the two major things we are always looking for in a paper. Now, what's to some degree beautiful about the formal essay is that it does not matter what the teacher has for an academic background. It doesn't matter where you are in school. You can be in your local junior college, or you can be attending the best university in America. And when an instructor gives the assignment of the academic essay, by and large, we're talking the same game. There may be some variations from instructor to instructor. And one of the things I'll talk about later, good students do, is they figure out just exactly what it is the instructor needs or wants, and then, of course, write specifically to that. There's nothing wrong with that, and good students will do this. Because what are we doing when we're writing a formal essay? We are demonstrating learning. We are showing we understand concepts. The better I can do that, obviously, the higher the grade I'm going to receive. The formal essay then, first of all, to the thesis and validation. We will always in formal writing begin with what I call the building block of the formal essay, paragraph. Now let's make sure we remember from way back when they taught it to us for the first time, what a paragraph is. We will define a paragraph for academic writing. We will define a paragraph as that unit of sentences, 5 to 7 sentences, which are built or created around a single idea or thought. Okay? We will oftentimes, of course, have a topic sentence, and we'll talk more specifically about what that is in paragraphing, okay? When we begin an academic essay, we will always begin then with paragraph number 1. Now, the approach that I am going to take in this lecture is a very simplistic one. The understanding is that formal essay writing can become more complicated and complex as one moves on up the ladder, as the game becomes more complicated. What I will be outlining here is what oftentimes is called a 5-paragraph essay. Please understand, it doesn't have to be 5 paragraphs. Typically, though, at the beginning of our essay, we have 1 paragraph of introduction. Here we will do several things. Let's take a look at what those things are. We will introduce the background of our thesis or our main idea. If we're writing, for example, about a literary text, we're going to provide some sentences of plot summary. Okay? If we're dealing with an author, we're going to provide some kind of biographic information. Okay? Now, we want to make a point here. Typically, what we're writing here is not what we call, at the earlier academic levels, a book report. Typically, a book report is a synopsis of a book with a final conclusive statement that sounds something like, this was a great book and I think everyone else should read it too. That's not what we're doing with an academic essay. We will almost never provide in an academic essay elongated or prolonged plot summary. In other words, we're not going to tell the teacher the story. We will work off of the assumption that the instructor has read the story, has read the poem, has read the book. And therefore, when we begin, we want to make sure, yes, we understand the story, but we're not going to tell the story over and over. That's what I mean when I say a brief statement or two of plot summary. Also, if we're using special terms in our paper writing, we want to make sure and define those terms. If we're using terms in a special way in our paper, we want to make sure that we have defined those terms correctly. Finally, we come to the final sentence of our intro paragraph. Our intro paragraph has built up to what is typically the last sentence of that paragraph, what we call the thesis sentence. Now, the thesis sentence, most of the time, is going to be what we call arguable. Now, what we mean here is that we are making some kind of argument. We are stating something, okay? Likewise, most academic theses will be relational. In other words, one thing is being related to another thing. One idea is being related to another idea. Now, this is not always true of academic thesis work, but most of the time, an instructor is going to ask of us to take one idea and to connect it with another idea. And if that sounds like something I said earlier, of course, that's called learning. In other words, we want to be able to demonstrate learning, okay? And our thesis will then have some elements that will allow for us to see a relationship between them. That same relationship that's in our thesis will occur later in the body paragraphs of our essay. To make sure that this is clear for you, I'd like you to take a look at just a couple of theses real quickly. Again, these are generated by my student, and I asked that she just take some thesis sentences directly from some papers that she recently wrote for me. Take a look at a couple of these very quickly. Notice that in the first one, we have the following sentence. The conflict between power and intelligence plays a significant role in the early books of Plato's Republic. Notice that in this thesis sentence, we are being asked to really discuss two ideas as they relate to each other. First of all, the conflict between power and intelligence. And second of all, the idea of the significant role these two things play. Look at one more. Contrary to Plato's views in Book 10 of Republic, art and artists are essential educators in any society. Notice again here that what the student is doing is taking the arguments that are made in a book and then going to critique those ideas, and it's there in the thesis sentence. Now, I said already that the thesis sentence is the single important sentence of the essay because it's the main focus of the entire essay. If I had to say one major problem with most student writing at the academic level, it is that they're not totally certain what they're saying. This is clear to me when, for example, a student comes up to me with a paper, and I will take the paper and lay it upside down and say, tell me what you're really saying in this paper and make it one sentence. Can I look at my... No, I don't want you to look at the paper. I want you to be able to actually tell me. What is it you're arguing in this paper? What is it that you're affirming? What is it that you wish to validate? Since I said validate, let's go to the second component. Issues of validation are very important. Once we know what it is we're wanting to argue, prove, validate, then we've got to be able to validate. Okay? We've got to actually do it. By the way, a good thesis test, and one that I like to give to my students, is to read a thesis sentence out loud and to ask this question. After it's finished, to simply say, oh yeah, prove it. That really does work rather nicely. Notice thesis sentences are never asked in the form of a question. Okay? For example, to go back to the thesis I was working with earlier, do I agree or disagree with Plato's view on artists in Book 10 of the Republic? See, that's not a thesis. It's phrased in the form of a question. And to say, oh yeah, prove it, after a question doesn't make any sense, you see. So we'll always use that as our thesis test. How we validate, of course, is going to be important in the what we call now body of our paper. The second major part of our paper, after the introductory comments and the thesis, is what we will call the body. Again, we're back to paragraphing one more time. Paragraphing is the beginning and end. So, for example, if you are writing a paper for an instructor, and the instructor has given a formal essay, and the instructor looks at your formal essay and doesn't see any paragraphing, immediately, already, we know something's very wrong with this paper. Immediately. In other words, if a professor or a teacher is looking at this paper, almost immediately a C paper. Immediately. Or lower. Because there's no paragraphing. Okay? Of course, we recognize paragraphing by that wonderful thing we call the indentation, which gives us a little bit of space at the beginning, or sometimes, of course, several spaces between the paragraph blocks to allow us to know new idea, new idea. Okay? We must, first of all, understand some terminology. We call what we do in the paragraphing in the body of our papers points of validation. This is what I call it. It's called lots of things. What we want to understand, though, is we're proving our points in the body of our paper. We have to have a topic sentence for each one of the paragraphs of our body. Now, of course, as they told you a long time ago, your topic sentence can come any number of places. But guess where I'm going to suggest that it come in an academic essay? For those of you who are thinking we should probably put it as the first sentence of, of each of those paragraphs, I'm saying you're exactly right. The reason is simple. Instructors often don't have a tremendous amount of time to read your paper. They might even end up scanning your paper. They are going to always, however, look at certain sentences very close. One, the last few sentences of the intro paragraph, because there is our thesis. And then, two, they will look at the first sentences of each of the ensuing body paragraphs to make sure that you understand specifically what it is that you are arguing. Now, we always want to make sure that the elements that are being related in our thesis sentence are as well being related in our topic sentences of our paragraphs. I want to go back quickly to the thesis that we were working with a few moments ago. There it is now on the screen in front of you. And notice that for each one of these two theses that we looked at, there are now POVs, points of validation, provided. Notice these are our topic sentences then for the three paragraphs of the body of this essay. You will notice that in each one of those, there is some discussion of the text, the Republic, as well as the idea that's being discussed. This is the point, then, that I want to make. There's a few other things that I want to say about validation. First of all, we want to point out that a quote does not make a point of validation. We always will explain a quote any time that we use it. And I strongly recommend that you never begin a paragraph with a quote. Always begin your paragraph with your topic sentence. What am I going to say in this paragraph? There are two types of validation within body paragraphs. The first is what we will call internal validation. In other words, when I'm working from a single text and I want to validate from that text and I give examples from the book over and over, that's what I call internal validation. The other kind of validation is the heart of academic writing. It is what we call external validation. Anytime I write a paper academically, I am always asking myself this fundamental question. What have other people said about my topic? What have other people said about my topic? And I go and I find what those other people have said, and then I will report, we'll use the word cite, I will cite that information in the body of my paper. The way that we do this is done through what we call style books. There are several different style books, the MLA style book, the APA style book, just to name a couple. You can find a book that I recommend called Form and Style on the bibliography in the booklets that are there with the tapes for you. And I strongly recommend that you, if you're going to do any academic writing, that you acquire one of these books and then study the examples provided there, what exactly it looks like. Finally, we have to finish the formal essay. After we have given our thesis, after we've given our points of validation, we now are ready to get to our what we call concluding paragraph. We want to leave our essay with some power. And we always want to write to affirm and not just drop our reader right there in the middle. So we will finish with a conclusion paragraph which does two things primarily. It will review the thesis and POVs, And then it does what I call extend beyond the thesis. In other words, we try to make some kind of a summation comment that takes us maybe a little beyond the thesis that we were writing about, so that we can at least demonstrate that we really have finished up with this essay well. Finally, of course, we have to have a reference page. If we are doing any kind of external validation, we are citing. And again, you will want to come back with me in Lecture 8, because there we're going to demonstrate specifically how a student takes an idea and generates a research project in the end, and you will get to see, in fact, what a reference page looks like. Okay, now just a couple of thoughts in conclusion here about the formal essay. First of all, you always want to begin a formal essay with a couple of titles. The first title is what I call the creative title. The second title is what we call the academic title. Notice the examples provided here on the screen for you quickly. The first example that you're going to see will always have the creative title. For example, Oh Boy is an example of a creative title. These, by the way, can be anything you wish for them to be. Usually, they want to elicit some energy or excitement on the part of the reader. But the second title will always occur in parenthetics, or at least be set off somehow, and will always begin with certain words like a critique of, a discussion of, an application of. Notice for this title, it is a critique of humans as they live in Homer's The Iliad. Notice that you have as well, for example, a creative title, Who's the Best? And then the academic title is a critique of the use of power and intelligence in Plato's Republic. Okay? Also, we want to understand our academic title sets up our thesis, which is one of the reasons we do it. We want to let our instructor know we understand what we're writing about. We always want to make sure that we write to affirm. We would like to take phrases out of our papers like I think or it seems, and we want to write with more strength to show that, in fact, we really do understand what we're saying. Typically, we take out words like, or phrases like I think, and we just simply say whatever it is that we think. If I say, I think that this book is a good book, instead of saying, I think this book is a good book, we just simply say, this book is a good book. Does that make sense? We always want to begin our essay with a plan or an outline. And we want to ask ourselves to consider the relationship between POVs within the body of the essay. This is very important for those of you who are writing at the higher levels of academic essay writing. We always want to ask this question. What do I say in POV number 1, which helps the reader understand POV 2? What do I say on POV number 2 that is significant to the understanding in POV 3? Does that make sense? Okay. Now I want to comment very briefly on editing. Editing in the academic essay writing, and of course even in informal writing as well, is very, very important. We only edit when we finally have some audience that we wish to see our material. That's what's significant about editing. That's why we don't worry about grammar in our jam writing. No one else will ever see it in our jam writing. But once we're ready to show it to someone, then we have to make sure that we do it well. Now, grammar rules are, for many of us, things that we did not learn well in school. We're going to have to go back, and we're going to have to learn those things. You'll remember in Lecture 1 I talked about academic deficiencies or weaknesses, and for some of my students, this is one of the major problems for them. You have to go back and learn it. But I have found that when a student is writing an editorial to the local newspaper and realizes that it will be seen by maybe several hundred, if not thousands of readers, all of a sudden the need to edit becomes very real. Does that make sense? Okay. Once we have an idea for an intended audience, then we want to obviously say it as well as possible. I like to think about editing as an upside-down pyramid. Take a look at what I place on the screen here in front of you, and notice how we edit a paper. We like to begin with the overall message or the thesis of the work. And we ask this question, is the piece doing what I want it to do? In other words, if I start out writing about the importance of environmental issues in the saving of seals, and I end up writing about killer whales instead, maybe I need to scrap this paper and go back to my original thesis. Maybe I like the paper on killer whales and I'll keep it. After I've looked at the overall message or thesis of the work, then I look at paragraph development. And I ask about my topic sentences and my POVs. Do my topic sentences work well with my thesis? Then I go to some sentence construction kinds of issues. Do my sentences flow together well? Is my usage good? Grammar proper? Finally, I work then with word selection. Notice what we're doing each time? See, we're getting a little more specific each time. Look, there's no reason to worry about whether you have spellings or not in your paper if you're not even writing on the appropriate topic. Does that make sense? There's no reason to worry about what sentence grammar looks like if your paragraphs don't even fit together at all with your assigned thesis, okay? This is why we kind of work down all the way to specifics. Am I using the right word, etc.? This is for us then one of the primary ways that we want to edit, with some kind of logic to our editing, okay? Now I want to make some specific comments about editing. One of the things that we want to always be able to do in our editing is to think about how we use our words. In other words, how specifically am I using words to create certain kinds of responses from my reader? Take a look at the graphic that's in front of you just to show you what I mean. One of the suggestions that I make to students is they learn how to improve their writing by making the reader ask why. Look at this. We can begin, and this is a project I like to do with my early writers, and it's always fun for them. I can write on the board what you see on the screen in front of you. The dog ran. A pretty simple sentence. Notice that we can begin to change this sentence, though, by putting in what we call adjectives. Notice that we can say, the big dog ran, or the ugly dog ran. Again, these are okay because they help us understand a little more about the dog. But take a look at what is provided next. The bloodied dog ran, or the mangled dog ran. Now notice what I've done, actually what my students have done, they're the ones who came up with these sentences. Notice what they've done by inserting certain kinds of adjectives. They've immediately asked the reader to ask what? Why is the dog bloodied? Why is the dog mangled? Notice as well that we can concentrate on adverbs, can't we? We can, for example, talk about how the dog ran. And we can also, of course, begin to play around with other types of sentence construction which make the reader want to know why. Okay? The last thing I want to talk with you about are what, for me, I see as a writing instructor, two major grammar problems. Okay? Now, this is not a lecture series on grammar, and obviously, if grammar is for you a major problem, you're going to want to get lots of help. But in the writing that I see, there are two major problems that seem to occur over and over, and I want to talk about both of them very quickly. The first is the use of the pronoun. And in our papers, we oftentimes will use pronouns, he, she, it, they, that. And we don't make it very clear exactly what it is we're in reference to. It would be, for example, like you going to your mother and simply walking up to her and saying to her, give me that. And she would obviously want to know what. The that we are talking about is the noun, or, of course, we call it an antecedent, which comes before the pronoun. One of the major mistakes students make in their writing is that they will begin paragraphs in the body of their paper with pronouns. Let me give you a couple of examples to kind of show you what this looks like. Notice the paragraph, or at least the part of the paragraph, that is in front of you on the screen. You will notice here that this paragraph begins, its topic sentence begins with a pronoun. The pronoun here is he. Notice he portrays the importance of the conflict as a theme, is the first words of this paragraph. Obviously the question is, who are we speaking of? The paragraph now can be corrected. Notice the correction reads, Plato portrays the importance of power. Notice that what we're doing here is we're beginning our sentences with an actual, what we're going to call noun or theme. Okay? And then once we have that information, then we can use the pronoun later in the paragraph. All right? The other problem for us, many of us as writers, is what we call sometimes fragments, run-ons, comma splices. Now these are major problems in our editing that if you understand the rule, it's very easy to see it. First of all, let's talk about what a run-on sentence is. A run-on sentence is not a sentence that goes on and on forever. As a matter of fact, a run-on sentence can be quite short. Take this as an example, and it will now appear on the screen in front of you. The stars were shining, the moon was bright. It's a lovely poetic line, so we'll use it. The stars were shining, the moon was bright. Now this looks like a sentence. We have a capital letter, we have a period. But there's a problem here. I actually don't have one sentence, do I? I really have two sentences. I have joined these two sentences together. The stars were shining is a full sentence. The moon was bright is a full sentence. I've joined them together, and notice I have joined them without any punctuation. None. This is what we call a run-on sentence. Okay? Any time that I am joining two full sentences together and I have no punctuation in between, we call this a run-on sentence, and it is, in our formal writing, it is incorrect. The way most students fix this problem is simply to put a comma between the two sentences. Let's go back to our graphic and look at it. Now it says the stars were shining, comma, the moon was bright. And they feel, many students feel, now I am okay. Well, in fact, you're still not okay. According to the formal rules of grammar, you have now committed that nasty error called the comma splice. Okay? Now, the comma splice can be fixed any number of ways, three primarily, and this is for my freshmen in English, one of the things that just drives them nuts. We can take our pen, we can put a little dot above the comma, we can call that a semicolon, and now we are okay. Okay? Now look, we don't get to make these rules up, we just have to abide by them when we're writing formally. We can use a comma, but we have to use what we call a conjunction afterwards. The stars were shining, comma, and the moon was bright, and then we're fine. Of course, the last way we can fix a comma splice is simply to put a period there and make the two sentences two sentences. Okay? Okay. What have we done? We've talked about writing, we've talked about jam writing and the creation of ideas and working from content to form, and then we've talked about informal writing and ways to improve that, and now in this lecture, formal writing. We talked about ways to create a good thesis and points of validation. And then finally, we talked about editing. What are we really trying to do? We're trying to demonstrate that we have learned something, and we do this through our writing. We will have a major demonstration of this all occurring in Lecture 8. But before we get there, there's one more piece in the puzzle, as I like to say it, that's still missing. That's what we call master scheduling. Come back in a few moments and we'll talk about how you can get organized for success. Hi, and welcome back to Lecture 7. In Lecture 7, we are going to address what is, for many students, one of the major academic weaknesses for them. We want to get on to Lecture 8 because there we're going to study a research project from start to finish. But there's one, as I said in the last lecture, piece in the puzzle left. It has to do with how we organize our time, how we answer the issues of procrastination, and how finally we make sure that all of our projects are getting done, not just a few of them. I'm reminded when I talk about master scheduling and how to overcome procrastination of a story that is told about Louis Pasteur, the great scientist biologist, who was told in a remark that he was a pretty lucky guy. And he had this quote to say. Take a look at this quote as it comes up on your screen. He said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Now, what I like about that quote is that it speaks directly to the whole idea that we are, I hope at least, trying to explain here in this lecture series, and that is, good students aren't just born majorly intelligent to get straight A's. Good students make themselves good students through any number of ways. We've already talked to some degree about how they do that. In this lecture, as I said, I want to talk about the master schedule. I really want to talk about two major things. I want to talk about how we develop a master schedule, and then I want to talk about how we use a master schedule. I will, as I have done in the past several lectures, I will have examples for you so that you then can see specifically what I'm talking about when I talk about master scheduling. First of all, I want to make sure that we understand what the real problem is for most students. Take a look at this graphic as I put it up and explain to you what for most students is a problem. On the graphic in front of you, you will notice the letter A. Allow it to represent one major deadline, and let's say that it is due on Friday. 90% of the students that I teach, I will give them a single deadline due on Friday. 90% of my students will make sure that that deadline is met and they do okay. But watch what happens on the graphic when I place up there the letters A, B, C, and D. And I say to a student, A is due in 2 days, B is due in 5 days, C I would like due a week later, and D you have a month left to do. Now watch what happens. Most of my students will accomplish the task of deadline A and maybe B. A few of them might start on C. Most of them never even get to D at all. This is what we call the problem of multiple deadlines. Back to the story that I opened with. John, you'll remember, was the fictitious name of the student who he and his parents sat across from the desk, and the mother asked what went wrong. John was struggling with multiple deadlines. When we go to the university, this is one of our major problems for first-year college and university students. They feel like they can't get all the work done because of multiple deadlines. Most students, when they miss a deadline, will report they don't have enough time. This is what I often hear students say. Mr. McGee, I would have gotten the paper in, but I just didn't have the time. I want to suggest, however, the following little quote. I made it up, but I'm going to use it anyway. Look at the screen and see this as I read it. Your problem is not that you do not have enough time. Your problem is that you do not use the time that you have well. Your problem is not that you don't have enough time. The problem for most of us is that simply we don't use our time to our full advantage. That's what we want to talk about here in getting organized. Really, there are kind of two things that we need to know if we're going to get organized as students. The first is we have to have specific kinds of information. Okay? We have to know specifically, and you're going to want to underline that word, specifically what is due in each one of our classes. The reason I'm having you underscore the word specifically is lots of students will say that, yeah, I have a test in another week or two. That's not specific enough. It's not enough to know in generalities. We have to know what reading, writing, exercise work, homework, and test or exam work is coming. These are the 4 things for every student they have to know specifically. Not only do we have to know what is due, but we have to know when specifically it's due. Again, it's not enough for me to know that I have a test on Friday. I have to know, back to our exam prep lecture, I have to know specifically what's on the test. Will this test cover chapters 3, 4, and 5, or just chapters 4 and 5? See, that's important for me, because if I have to cover 3, 4, and 5, my exam preparation is going to begin earlier. If I only have chapters 4 and 5, maybe a little bit later. And if it's only chapter 5 and I feel like I know that material well, I might only need a day or two of exam preparation. I'm hoping that in this master schedule lecture then, you will begin to see how important it is we do master scheduling if we're going to be able to do learning journals as we defined them in lectures 2 and 3. The only way that I can do learning journals is if I know what in fact is going to be covered the next day in class. Think about this too. If you are sitting watching this lecture right now and you have a math class and I were to ask you, what specifically will you be reading for tonight to prepare for tomorrow's class in math? And you don't know the answer to that question. The obvious issue for you is, why not? Now, who usually knows this information? Obviously the teacher. So for us, we want to make sure that we go to our teachers to obtain this information And I will be speaking here in a moment specifically about ways that you will want to do that. We talk about the steps of master schedule development, and I want to kind of go through these with you. First of all, to step one, we have to, first of all, determine what time is available for us for our study. We've got to know how we are using our time at the moment. And the key here, obviously, is honesty. We want to be honest. So this is what I recommend that you do. First of all, sit down and make a chart. Make a chart that looks something like the graphic that's on the screen now in front of you. Along the bottom of the chart, you will want to take a look at possible projects that are maybe coming up. Across the top of the chart, we will be placing the days of the week. There they are in front of you, Monday through, always include the weekend days of Saturday and Sunday. Along the left-hand side of the chart, you will want to place the time you normally wake up in the morning, and there you will want to put the time you consistently rise in the morning, all the way down by hourly divisions to the time that you go to sleep in the evening, okay? Then what I would want you to do is to think about what specifically it is that you do during each of those moments most of the time. Take a look at the graphic that is in front of you. You will notice here that this is a master schedule, early master schedule, step 1 for Anna. And take a look that you will notice that she has certain things that she does consistently. The empty spaces that are left for you need to be counted up. The empty spaces are the spaces that you will be using to do your study. This is an interesting project for many students who come to me and say, Mr. McGee, I don't have the time to get my studies done. But then when they put together this project, they sometimes will record 15 or maybe 20 blank spots on their chart. You will notice, of course, each blank spot equals 1 full hour, which is to say, Mr. McGee, I have sometimes 20 to 25 hours really unused time, for the most part, consistently unused time. This, of course, is where we will want to be doing some of our major study. Step 2. Step 2 of the master schedule is for us to answer some very important questions, and I've already raised them. We have to go to the source for our information. Here, of course, we're talking about teachers. Now, for those of you who are in high school, most of the time, and this is to some degree unfortunate, high school teachers do not provide daily or weekly course outlines. The difference at university or college is that most college instructors are required to provide a weekly course outline, what we call a course syllabus. What you will find oftentimes is that high school teachers don't provide this information to students, but they do have this information. Students just have to be able to ask for it. We will always then begin with the teacher. If there is no syllabus, then we need to go and to acquire this information. We are, again, interested in knowing specifically what's due in reading and in writing and in exercise work and in what quiz or exam work is due. I want to talk for a few moments about how you need to do that. If you are in a class, let's say a math class, if you are in a class and the teacher has not up to this point provided a syllabus for you, and you feel like you need to know specifically what kinds of pieces of information are coming for the class, how specifically should you do that? A couple of suggestions. First of all, what I believe you should say to the teacher. Go to the teacher and say, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, I need your help. Now, I always recommend that you begin with this phrase, because when you do this, you will then immediately allow the teacher to know that what you are doing is not asking a question which is trying to make them look bad, because this is information maybe they don't know, or maybe they should have given it to students and you're trying to point this out. None of that. When you say to them, I need your help, you are touching a teacher at the very core of why they teach. I need your help because I want to be a better student in your class. To do that, I need the following information. I need to know what is due for the next 2 weeks out. We ask, if possible, that you can get 2 weeks out of information. This is our hope. I need 2 weeks out information on what reading, what writing, what exercise work, and what exam work is coming. And as the instructor gives this information to you, there is, again, any number of ways that they can give this information to you. I personally always recommend that you never ask this question in front of other students. I would strongly recommend that you never place a question like this out there in front of your colleagues, in front of the teacher. One good reason, and we'll talk more about this in Lecture 9, one good reason is you never want to place yourself in a situation where it might be understood by the teacher as you trying to attack them. In issues of power dynamics, as I talk about it in Lecture 9, this is a war you can never win. You want the instructor to understand you're not trying to make them look bad by asking for information that they haven't provided. Also, it is possible that maybe your instructor doesn't know the information. And obviously asking in front of the class will only place them right on the spot, and oftentimes a teacher will respond maybe in a way that would be unkind and not helpful. So my recommendation is always to ask this question, for example, after class when you are alone. Of course, there is always the issue, and we'll talk more about this in Lecture 9. We don't want to simply put ourselves as good students out there in front of other students to be kind of humiliated or to be called the class nerd because we're interested in studies. And sometimes students who are our colleagues might think we're trying to make them look bad by asking this question in front of them. So I recommend that you ask it after class. Many of my students will ask their teachers in the form of writing. They will write a note that they just simply leave for the teacher. The note will say, in a couple of days, is it possible for you to give me the information over the next 2 weeks? One of the important things, though, here is for you to understand that this is information you must have if you are going to do your early pre-class learning journals. Back to the math example with section 7.1. If the 7.1 information is to be presented on Tuesday, I have to have that information for me on Monday. In other words, Monday night I'm reading 7.1 to come to class to receive the information on 7.1 on Tuesday. So it's very important that I get this information from a teacher. And if for some reason or another the teacher isn't quick in giving me this information, I don't give up. I just keep coming back, asking gently, but staying with it. I really need this information so that I can do better in your class. Now, once I have step 1, and I have information provided to me about when I might be able to do my studies, and once I have step 2, I have the specific information, underscore specific again, of what's due and when. Finally now, I'm ready to create what we call the master schedule. We make a master schedule chart now to include all important information for at least 2 weeks out. Take a look at a couple of examples that I provide for you now on a graphic of what a master schedule looks like. By the way, master schedules can look different for students. There's no one set way that it has to look. I asked some of my 9th graders to simply show me the kinds of master scheduling that they are doing. Take a look. Notice on this graphic, the first thing that you see is down the side you will see a list of the important classes and, of course, as well, the dates. Here we're looking at a November 3rd through 9th date, for example. Down the side of the page, the listing of the important core classes, in other words, academic classes, where there would be reading, writing, and that kind of thing. Then notice that there will be a listing across on the top of reading, writing, exercise work, test work. Then for each one of these important classes, notice, there will be the information that is provided. What type of tests, what types of exercises, what types of writing, what types of reading. Notice that as we give you several of these examples, they all look pretty much the same. Now, obviously, one way to do this is to use a date book. And oftentimes, students will use a date book. These came from a student date book, and I strongly recommend that you have one. If you are at all interested in improving your study habits, one of the early on things you must acquire is a student date book, and you have to use it. Now, you could be like one of my students once who said, I need my date book to remember to use my date book. In other words, just because we have it written down doesn't necessarily mean that we're always going to do it. But it's at least a good first start for us. Parents, any time that they want to sit down and speak with their son or daughter about their studies, one of the first suggestions I make is to ask your son or daughter to pull out their master schedule and show it to you. If they don't have a master schedule, that may explain why it is they're struggling, for example, in chemistry or in mathematics or in English. One more time, I want to just reiterate how important it is that we work with a master schedule if we're going to do learning journals. We cannot do learning journals without having a master schedule. It is at the heart of all that we do if we're going to be good students. Why exactly is it we are reading before we come to class? Because we want to learn. And what is learning? The ability to connect new ideas to old ideas. When that math teacher is presenting the information on Tuesday from 7.1, and I've already read it the night before, that information is for me old information. I've already seen it once. So therefore, the second time I hear it, I am able, hopefully, to begin to do more important learning. Now, the only way I can do that is to know the night before what it is I have to read. I cannot emphasize this enough. If a student is struggling in mathematics, the first question is to ask, what kind of reading study are you doing before you come to class? If you're waiting until you get to class to learn the concept for the first time or be exposed to it, you will become frustrated, especially if you struggle as a math student. Again, it's not enough to have a master schedule. You have to follow it. And one of the recommendations that I make for students is that they always begin a study session, back to that discussion of how one should study. I recommend that you always study by opening up your master schedule first and making what I call a to-do list. A to-do list is simply a listing of the important things that have to be done. When, for example, we get to Lecture 8 here in a little bit, and we take a look at Anna's research project, one of the things we're going to see is that she developed immediately a master schedule. Any good student will do this. And then, day by day, there is a to-do list. Now, my wife has a theory, and I'm inclined to believe there's some truth to this theory. She says that there's some power in making a to-do list, and then after you've finished with it, marking it off. That there's some power in marking it off, some sense of completion, some sense of achievement. I believe that she's right. At the end of the day, when you have written a to-do list and actually marked off those things, you are able to see in a visible way that you've done something. And that's important for a student, isn't it? Oftentimes when we finish, we're just tired. We know we worked a lot, but we're not always certain exactly what it is that we did. I know that oftentimes people will say, man, I feel really tired at the end of the day, but I'm not always certain exactly what it is I accomplished. A to-do list marked out will provide us with that basic information. This is specifically what I did. Take a look at it. So I would recommend that you at least try to employ a to-do list for yourself, maybe rising in the morning, taking a look at your master schedule, asking yourself, what specifically is it I have due today? Make that list, and throughout the course of the day, referring back to it. The lifeline of good students is this master schedule. Their date book is important to them because therein lies all of their plans for not just this week, but next week and the week after. See, when a student comes to me and says, Mr. McGee, you know, I'm not doing very well in chemistry, my first question is, what are you reading tonight in chemistry for tomorrow's lecture? Chapter 7? Good. What are you reading the day after that in chemistry? 8? Good. What are you reading a week from now in chemistry? Oh, come on, Mr. McGee, I don't even know what I'm reading. Right. There's your problem. See, our problem for most of us as poor students is that we come to class unprepared, and that's because we don't have a master schedule. We have to get to a teacher, we have to ask for this information, we have to have it written down somewhere, and then we have to review it through the to-do list. Finally, in the last few minutes now, I want to talk about some practical applications and some suggestions for the use of the master schedule. And we've got to talk about the P word, procrastination. This is one of those kinds of issues that we find ourselves sometimes talking about as if it's really not that big of a deal, when in fact we know that sometimes it really is. It's like a mother once said to me in a parent-teacher conference about her daughter. She said, you know, Mr. McGee, my daughter was born late. She's always been late. And I think that sometimes we feel this way. But the truth is, we have to make sure that we get stuff done if we're going to be good students. The power of knowing what's due is that you can decide to finish it now or later. For example, think about this. If I am a student and I know that I have math homework this evening that has to be finished, and I sit down and I am on page 20, and I have to do 15 exercises on page 20, and I have my to-do list there, and it's the last thing I have to accomplish, and it's now 7:10 at night, and I get ready to do it when up to my front door comes 3 of my friends, and they say, "Come on, let's go catch a movie at 7:30. Come on, let's go. What do you say?" Now, I have a major decision to make here, right? I have to decide if, in fact, I'm going to sit and do my homework or if I'm going to head and go with them to the movie. Now, I could ask a majorly loaded question: what would a good student do? The answer is either one. That's right. The answer is either one. Because a good student who has a master schedule knows what to do, right? They have it written down. They can go to the movie, and they can enjoy the movie. Now, some students will go to the movie anyway, but the whole time they're sitting there going, oh boy, I should be doing my homework, and I'm not. Oh boy, that's not. Oh boy, now what am I going to? Good students don't have to worry about that. They have made a conscious decision because they're in control. They have a master schedule which tells them, look, this is due tomorrow, second hour. They also know that they want to enjoy their friends. I'll talk more about that in Lecture 9. So they make a decision. I'm going to go to the movie, which means that I'm not going to get my homework done this evening, but I know I've got 15 problems. That will take me approximately 30 minutes to do. I will rise tomorrow at 5:30 instead of 6. See, I'm going to get up 30 minutes early. I'm going to do my homework. Simple. This allows for them to be able to go to the movie, enjoy the movie, come home, go to bed, get up in the morning at 5:30 when they set their alarm clock. It's the payoff for enjoying the film the night before with their friends. This is what good students do. Once you have a master schedule, you know then specifically how you're going to get the work finished. One of the fun things about this is a lot of times there will be college students who have mastered the master schedule, and they'll come home for Thanksgiving and they have no homework, and their parents think they must not be very good students, when the truth is what they've done is what? Well, they've got all of their homework done before they left for Thanksgiving so that they can enjoy the break. It's a good suggestion. The master schedule looks like it takes a lot of time, but actually in the end it saves you time. Think about it. You're not wasting a lot of mental energy, and this is what good students do. They know how to conserve mental energy so they're not wasting their time kind of running around all over the place. Also, I want to talk about small rewards real quickly. If you keep to your master schedule, for example, for a week, you can reward yourself. For example, for a Saturday with no homework, you can take a day off. Again, as I just said, college students oftentimes will report that they can finish their work so they don't have any homework over the Thanksgiving break, and that is for them good. The other thing I would recommend in terms of using a master schedule is to use the support of your parents to help you in keeping on task. One good way to fix the procrastination problem is to go to your parents and admit that it is a problem. Mom, look, I've been watching Mr. McGee's lectures, for example. Mr. McGee suggested that procrastination is a serious problem. I'm going to go ahead and be honest enough to admit that it is a problem for me. And too often I just make up excuses. I need your help. See, we use that phrase a lot for good students. I need your help. For the next week, I'm going to try and keep a master schedule, and I want you to remind me every once in a while. And even though I might yell at you and say, leave me alone, please understand that I'm really not yelling at you. I'm just angered because I probably need to be doing it more. Use your parents to help you and their support. Use the master schedule as well in group study. I mentioned group study as an important dynamic, and the master schedule is the way that a group can really work together. One of the most important things about groups is that we stay on task. When people show up, we want everybody in the group to have some idea of what's going to be covered. Master schedules obviously allow for that to happen. Your meetings are going to go way more efficient. You're going to get a lot more work done. And think about it, that's going to leave you more time to socialize, which is why we enjoy our groups in the first place. You know, what did you think about last night? That kind of thing. Now to some detailed use of the master schedule in conclusion. First of all, we want to develop a reading schedule that will help us keep on our reading. Think about this for a second, and maybe for some of you this will blow your mind. If you were to only read 10 pages a day of a book for 30 days, how many pages have you read at the end of a month? At only 10 pages a day. Now think about this. I have students who will look at a book, they have a month to get it read, and they say, there's no way I'm going to get this thing read. Of course, there's no way you're going to get it read in 3 nights. Good students look at all of the work that they have. They look at the amount of time that they have. They divide one into the other. I can take a 300-page novel. I can read 10 pages every night, which is maybe something I don't have to do in one sitting either. I could read 5 pages in the morning. I could read 5 pages in the evening. See? And I can do it in small chunks. Learning journals allows for me to do this because I can always go back and read my learning journal notes to make sure I didn't forget any parts of the book that I've been reading. And that way, by the end of the month, I've read my book without a tremendous amount of frustration that I'm not getting it read on time, etc. Also, we want to think about writing projects and the demands placed on us by writing projects. The whole writing process demands that you know when a project is due so you can plan accordingly. In other words, we want to make sure that we are planning our editing properly. One of our major problems for us is the paper's due Friday morning and we're writing it for the first time when? Whoops. You're not going to have a whole lot of time to do a whole lot of editing when the paper's being written at 1 a.m., right, on the very day that it's due. We have to be able to plan accordingly. We have to know in advance. The master schedule allows for you to consider as well all your classes equally. Too many students will use their physics to explain why they missed their English deadline. Mr. McGee, I would have had my paper in, but we had this major project in science, and that one took me all week, and I just didn't... Wait. We want to make a promise as students. We will never, ever, ever use another class as an excuse for missing a deadline. Because the truth is, it's not an excuse. We know, if we're good students, what's due in every class. We know that. So that will mean for us then that we are always trying to look ahead and always know at least 2 weeks in advance what's happening in every one of our core classes. Core classes, again, simply those classes where we have reading, writing, exercise work, exam work. And we're always thinking, what is due ahead? Finally, in the last few minutes remaining, I want to talk specifically about some of the issues related to our life that are involved with work, extracurricular, and athletics. Working, I believe, is a very important part of the high school dynamic. But we want to make sure studies always come first. We want to try to obtain as much as possible our work schedule 2 weeks in advance so that we can plan accordingly. Go to your manager again and say, please, I need your help. I want to be a good worker, but I want to be a good student. I want to do them both. Can you let me know 2 weeks out what my work schedule is going to be so that I can plan accordingly? It's very important as well that you become involved in the life of the school. You want to know in advance what projects for the semester are due. The other important thing is athletics. Athletes oftentimes, unfortunately, will use their athletics as an excuse to miss deadlines. Good athletes would never do that, just like a good athlete understands if I'm going to be a good athlete, I have to train. They would never use their academics as an excuse. But you can go to your coach and let them know, I really want to do well in the classroom. Is there any way that I can know in advance what types of travel schedules I'm going to be involved with for the season? So, for example, if I'm going to be out of town on a Friday, I might want to get my work done beforehand on a Thursday. Does that make sense? Most coaches will appreciate that you all of a sudden have found maybe a newfound interest in academics, because the truth is, if you're going on to play at the college level, you've got to do it in a classroom too, which is, of course, why many athletes don't do well at the next level. They never really learned how to study at the high school level. Okay, we've finished now with some major information, and we're ready to look at a research project that puts it all together. I'm excited to do that with you, and I'll come back in a moment to talk with you about how that looks. Hi, and welcome back. This is Lecture 8 of our series. Let's review where we have been up to this point, and then let's talk a little about what we're going to do for the next few minutes. We began in this series with an introduction to learning. We talked about the important concepts of learning, the ability to connect new information to old information. We talked about the importance of an approach. We talked about learning journals. We talked about how we want to read before we come to class. We talked about how important it is during class that we are taking appropriate notes. And then we spoke a little about exam preparation and overcoming test anxiety, things like that. Finally, we talked about master scheduling and how to get organized to make sure that we can make sure that we're always on task when we write. And then also we talked a little about writing and important ways that we can approach our writing. We want to work from some idea to form instead of the other way around. We talked about jam writing, and we talked about formal versus informal writing. Now, we're going to try in this lecture to put it all together. To some degree, we can think about this as the high point now of our lecture series, because now that we've introduced all of these concepts, we're going to watch one student, the student who we've been observing in her graphics up to this point, Anna Sopko, take a project from start to finish. Now, we will call this a research project for a reason, because the understanding is, right from the start, we are going to do research as we do our writing. What we want to do today now is to watch how Anna will do this right from the beginning, right to the end. There will be all kinds of graphics that you will be seeing to kind of help you understand exactly how Anna moves from point A, the beginning, to point B, the conclusion. Okay? The way this lecture will break down is, first of all, I will outline the assignment as I gave it to Anna. Then secondly, I will walk through the steps with you, showing you student work. Now, this is important to me because you are now going to watch a student at work as I explain what it is she did. This will show you exactly what student work looks like, as opposed to something maybe that I or my colleagues might create. To this degree, this is going to be, I think, much more informative than most textbooks that maybe even explain these concepts. Okay? Finally, in the last few moments remaining, we're going to critique or evaluate just how Anna did what she did. We'll maybe make some constructive comments and criticisms about things that maybe even she could have done in other ways. Okay? So let's talk for a few minutes about the assignment. Now, you need to understand something about this assignment as it's placed within the context of the teaching semester. Okay? I have already lectured to Anna when she receives this assignment on Plato and Plato's Republic. She's been studying for a period of about 2 weeks with me on the Republic with the rest of the AP English class that I instruct. So as Anna receives this assignment, there's already some background knowledge that she has, which will actually play an important role in the research project formulation, which is good because you'll remember we call learning the ability to connect new information to old information. So if we've instructed in Plato, it's going to be important that maybe she try to use some of that information. Quickly, let's outline the project. First of all, Anna was asked to read 3 essays which treated democracy and to do what we called learning journals. The 3 essays, the first one, Tom Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. The second one, Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, Nonviolent Resistance. And the third, an essay by Margaret Mead called Egalitarian Error. Now, these 3 essays all treat, in some way, several different ideas on, of course, political theory. We were asking Anna to focus specifically on issues of democracy and principles of democracy. She had to consider how she would get the project completed in 5 school days. And in fact, that's how we will break it 1. Day 1 we'll call Monday. Day 5 we will call Friday. Okay? Anna then had to use her jam writing after she created a master schedule. She, from her jam writing, then had to draw ideas which she could then formulate as a thesis and points of validation. She then had to go out and do research. She will do research from a multiple sources that she could find, both hard copy as well as the internet. And then finally, she had to construct a paper which would have at least 3 drafts. Now, there's several things we want to already kind of highlight before we start looking at Anna's work. Things we will be looking for, if you will. We want to notice how important it was early on for her to consider the time element. Now, obviously, other research projects might take more time, and we will point this out again in a few moments. For Anna, the first number one priority when she was assigned the project was simply the question, how will I get this done in the amount of time that I have? And her master schedule will show this, she had other projects she had to consider. It wasn't as if she could just simply say, okay, I have this project for the 5 days, I'm going to take all of my other jobs and set them off to the side and not even think about them. She had all of her other classes, she had work, and then the other forensics work that she does as part of her work for school. Secondly, we will want to notice how Anna's active reading, remember we use that term and we also called it annotation, how her active reading was the basis for all of her research. She had to discover through her jam writing what for her was the basis of all of her thesis and validation work. She had to decide what it was the essays were telling her so that she could then begin to create a thesis that she would validate through research, internal validation as well as external validation as we defined it in prior lectures. The major part of the assignment was for Anna to do research as well, which is to say she had to demonstrate that she was capable of doing the research. She had to go to several sources and she had to find that research, and then once she had that research, she had to be able to put it in the context of a formal essay. Finally, and maybe even most difficultly, she had to write a paper where she was capable of taking this information and synthesizing it into a thesis and validation and going through several drafts. The drafts would begin not with me, the instructor, but with her peers. She allowed for her mother to read the essay as well, long before I ever saw it as the instructor, and then she gave it to me. Now, I will pause for a moment and point out that this was a somewhat frightening project for Anna because she understood that you would be watching her mistakes. And you will see, in fact, many of her mistakes as we work through this project. I think, though, this is important. Good students understand that they don't sit down and simply write a research paper or project in one sitting. There are quite a few stages involved that involve quite a bit of hard work, criticism, and critique. Along the way, we will study how specifically, though, Anna is able to identify her problems and then correct those problems in the next draft. Anna's paper actually ended up with 4 drafts, although she only was required to have 3. The final draft, however, occurred after she had emailed her paper to me, and we did this so that we could demonstrate how you can edit papers even through this new medium, which is very exciting because it allows then for a student to be able to send their paper, if you have this technology, to a colleague that's far away and say, what do you think of this paper and how would you critique it? So these are the things that we are most interested in as we are taking a look at Anna's project. Okay, let's go now to a detailed explanation of the project. Again, I want to point out that this is really a hypothetical situation or scenario. Many research projects will take much longer than this, and also, and we will say this later again, this is a research paper in the end. However, it could have just as easily been a different kind of research project, a presentation which would, for example, have been in the form of a video project, or it could have been some kind of theatrical project, okay? But the approach is going to be primarily the same. Okay, first of all to day 1. While I am talking, you will see any number of examples which will be provided for you that will explain what I'm talking about with you. Specific examples, and then I will be highlighting parts, maybe even, of these examples so that you can understand what I'm speaking about. Let's talk about day 1 and Monday. The essay packet was given to Anna on day 1 with the assigned topic. The assigned topic for Anna was to read 3 essays and to decide on 3 important principles of democracy. Again, reminding you that these were essays that had something to do with political science theory and also democracy. And not only to find 3 important principles of democracy from the 3 essays, but to as well go out, get some research after a thesis and validation has been accomplished. And the deadline is Friday, day 5. Okay? Let's notice that first of all, and this I think is very important, and it takes us back to lecture 7. The first thing Anna did was sit down and ask herself, what do I have to get done, and how am I going to do it? Now that, of course, we call a master schedule. Notice that this is exactly what Anna does. She goes to a master schedule. Notice on the left-hand side she writes, what do I have which is due? And she makes a list for herself for the first day, which here we call October 27. Notice that she has a listing for herself, and then on the right-hand side, she has the homework for that evening, which has to be done. Notice on the 28th, the homework from the evening of before now becomes the due information, and then later on that evening of the 28th, she has other work which has to be done. Notice as well that there are several occasions on this outline master schedule where Anna has injected not only the work she's doing for this project, but also the other work. For example, she has here that she has calculus homework that as well she must do for the evening of the 27th. So it's important then that Anna understands that she has other work outside of the work that she's doing just for this project. Secondly, Anna had to sit down the evening of the first day on Monday and read the essays. Now you'll remember that we said reading is not just reading. We have social reading and we have active reading or academic reading, and Anna of course is going to do academic reading for a project of this scope, and so she will sit down and begin to do her reading, beginning with her internal annotation. Annotation or note-taking which is done right on the page. Now I would like for us to look for a few moments at what Anna did with the Declaration of Independence. Because we don't have a lot of time here, I'm not going to be able to go into detailed internal annotation notes with you. But I want you to get a gist for the kinds of things that Anna was doing as she was carrying on a dialogue with Jefferson. See, that's what we do when we read internally. Notice, first of all, as you look at the page, that there will be red marks. This is a surefire giveaway that we are doing internal annotation or note-keeping. Notice that she will have several times comments made in the margins, one time, in fact, agreeing strongly with what Jefferson says, and she says so in the form of a yes with an exclamation mark. Finally, a little bit later, there is a question that Anna asks. She asks, who gave them rights, in reference specifically to a comment by Jefferson in the Declaration, and then she will, in parenthetics down below, make the comment that there is maybe something to be found from Plato. Notice as well that at the end of the Declaration, she will ask a question, that she will place it there at the top of her internal annotations, and she quotes from a study that we had already engaged in from Plato's Republic, Book 1, How Can You Persuade Us If We Refuse to Listen? Now, after Anna finished with her internal annotation, internal note-keeping, she was ready to move on to her external note-keeping. She had to, of course, find some way to take some notes down that she could use maybe later on her paper. Take a look at how she set up her learning journals. On the left-hand side of the page, she is going to take notes from the Declaration of Independence, the MLK piece, and the Meade piece. On the left-hand side, she is going to be making comments to herself. Notice that she is doing several things. 1, writing down important thesis information and points of validation. 2, she's also asking important questions about how specifically this information works for her. Okay? Finally, she will then end day 1 with her pre-class learning journal work, and she's ready to come to class for day 2. Let's go quickly now to day 2, and you will notice as you are looking at your outlines in front of you for your booklet that this is the major work in the week. Day 2, of course, is going to be how she sets up her first draft. But before, and this is significant, she gets ready to write her paper, she has several operations she has to do first. the most important, obviously, is to come to class prepared. Now, we spoke of this already. Anna comes to class with her learning journals, and you will notice now in her learning journals on the right-hand side that she has notes that she has been taking during class. During each of the lectures on the 3 essays, which I gave, she was taking notes, trying to find matching information. That was information that for her she had already seen in the essay, and of course new information, information that for her she had not seen before, that maybe would help her in creating her paper. After she finished with her learning journals, step 1 and step 2, she then was ready to begin to consider where she wanted to go with her paper. What kinds of ideas, thesis, and validation work will I be working with now? The way we get there is not to sit down, however, and to write the formal essay. Again, that is a mistake most of the time. Instead, what Anna did was to sit down and work with jam writing. And that's exactly what she did. She sat down for 10 to 15 minutes nonstop and she wrote. You will notice as you look at her jam writing that this is very personal writing. Again, it's not normally to be seen by anyone else. For purposes of explanation, however, Anna allowed me to show you what her jam writing looks like. Notice again that she begins very personal. She says, I was given the essay topic when the 3 democracy essays were handed out, so my reading of them was mainly focused on the 3 authors' views of democracy. So now I'm supposed to come up with what I consider to be 3 important principles of democracy. Well, obviously, I think I'll derive this from the knowledge given me by Jefferson, King, and me. I'll first focus on the Declaration of Independence. What was Tom's main message in that topic? Now notice, of course, we wouldn't call Jefferson Tom in a formal essay, but here she is going to be very informal. She's writing to herself. Notice she's asking herself questions. What am I going to write on? After Anna finished with her jam writing, she was ready then to begin to move to some kind of study of her jam writing. And this is exactly what she did. She will, you notice, highlight for herself her own jam writing. Notice that she will come back with red pen. Anything she sees that she might be able to use, she's highlighting. She's making comments. She's making circles. Then Anna created what we sometimes call an outline jam outline. And what we're doing here is not a formal outline, but a very informal outline, where she is going to create a rough outline expanding possible thesis and POVs. In other words, she's asking the simple question, what are 3 potentially important principles of democracy that I'm learning from these 3 essays? Notice at this point, just to interject, that Anna hasn't yet gone to any external research, hasn't worried about that yet. She at the moment is wanting to focus primarily on the 3 required texts that have been given to her, and she's trying to understand for herself how specifically all of this is working. Notice that in your jam outline, she as well is beginning to create possible internal validation or quotes. Quotes from the essays themselves that maybe will help her. Finally, after some internal validation work, Anna is ready to begin to go to external validation sources. Anna went to the library. She had any number of places that she could look. She went through the SIRS and the info tract. She as well, of course, was going to look at Newsbank and then, of course, books. And then finally, she would maybe consider the internet along with magazine articles and the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Anna, you will notice, had several differing kinds of external validation. I like for you to just see the kinds of ways that she took these notes. Now, there's any number of ways a student can do this. They can, of course, use index cards or a piece of notebook paper. The real key here, unless an instructor is requiring that somehow there's a special way to do this kind of research, the real key here is just simply that a student is able to get the information. You will notice that this information for Anna is somewhat rough. There are scratched-in notes. She's trying to decide specifically how she will work with each one of these 3 essays, and more particularly how her external validation, that information that she finds in magazine articles from Newsweek, in Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, how that information works specifically with ideas she's already created. This is what's significant about beginning the way she did. She already had the ideas in her mind fairly clearly, so she was ready when she went to the external validation or research to be able to ask, how does what this article says in Newsweek fit with what I'm already working with in my ideas? Always, of course, open to the possibility of changing or adapting principles or ideas for points of validation. Finally, at the conclusion of the second day, Anna had to write draft 1. For her, this was, of course, like for any student, a major challenge. She began with an outline, she sat down, and she wrote her paper. The next day, Wednesday, she had several peers edit her paper, and then she sought out several of her closer friends and even her mother, and they all edited this paper for her. She then brought it to me. What you see is the first editing of her paper by me. Now, one of the things immediately that you will note is the remarkable amount of red ink that you see on the paper. This is, of course, to be understood. What we are doing here, of course, is trying to find any kind of weaknesses that we can in the paper. You will notice, for example, that I'm asking her questions. I'm also making comments to her about trying to stay away from certain types of phrasing. Notice that at the last paragraph on the first page, I asked her to consider reading her paper out loud because the ideas sound somewhat rough. And we want her to work with trying to make her ideas more smooth in the first draft. At the conclusion of the third day, Wednesday, we then have finally draft 2 written. See, the reality is every time we do these drafts, we're going to get a little better, and this is exactly what happened for Anna. On the 4th day, Anna finally will have the second draft of her paper. She will email her paper, in fact, to several of her friends who were away at college. Now, again, you may not have this technology available to you, but if you do, this is a wonderful way to help get other ideas to help create drafts for yourself. Lots of ideas. The more people who are reading your paper, the more ideas, obviously, that you can have. Notice that in draft 2 of Anna's paper, there are less red marks. Notice that my comments as the instructor now are having more to do with how she is setting up her quotes. In other words, trying to, for the most part, create the very best lead-in to a quote that she can. Okay? Finally, at the conclusion of day 4, she had what we would call the final draft of her paper. And she will then, notice, begin with a quotation. We have finally worked through our creative title, our academic title. We have an intro quote, and then finally we are leading into our paper particularly. Anna on the 5th day showed up to class ready to present her paper. What she did here then was to come in front of the class and to read or orally present her paper. One of the powers of this kind of presentation is that for one more time, she could then hear the flow of her ideas. Reading aloud your paper is a great way to hear the nuances of the language. Does the transition between the first point of validation and the second point of validation really work? She had already read her paper the night before in practice, because that's a good suggestion to always practice, especially if you have any kind of stage fright or you don't like to present your ideas so much in front of other people. For Anna, her advantage is that she has been trained in forensics, and so for her this was not very difficult. She came to the class, she presented her paper orally, and, this is significant, the class responded back to Anna with comments. Now, these comments were constructive comments, but they were something more than, "Nice job, Anna." The class themselves had to think about what Anna was doing as she presented her paper. Where had she worked to validate a thesis well? Where could she maybe work on transitional phrases and that type of thing? Finally, of course, Anna's paper had to be handed in for a grade. She would at this point, of course, have a reference page that would demonstrate that she had done the research. She, of course, will have cited that research in her paper, and then she will demonstrate the reference page. She will, of course, have, notice on this reference page, she will have broken down the reference page by articles that she's using, books that she's using, and then finally her internet site that she was using. Anna had to use all three of these in the creation of the validation for her paper. Okay. As we finish out this lecture, I would like for us to take a few minutes and critique Anna's performance. Specifically, what is it that she did well? What is it that she could have improved on? Let's take a look. First of all, we want to remind ourselves that the thing that made Anna's paper so powerful and good at the end of 5 days was that she started on day 1 with a master schedule. If there is any suggestion that I can make to a student who has been given a project that will take several days, it is to sit down before we start working and think about what has to be done, when it has to be done, and what are the steps in between. Notice one of the very important things Anna did was to make sure that she was thinking about her other coursework, not just this project. It's of no value to a good student to meet the deadline in one class, but to have missed deadlines in 3 other classes because of that. Remember, we will never want to use the excuse of work in one class to somehow excuse our work in another class. We want to stay away from that. And the master schedule for Anna worked well. Notice that we have to read actively. Everything that happened in the paper later in the 3rd day happened because of the active reading that occurred in the 1st and the 2nd day. How we read the paper was important as well to being able to take good class notes. Notice that if Anna had not read the paper on her own and had come to class only to listen to my lecture, it's altogether possible that her thesis and validation would have simply been a reporting back to me of what I had said in my lecture. Okay? Now that is a major problem for a lot of students. If you don't read the paper in advance and kind of think through it on your own, you will oftentimes find yourself simply reporting back to the instructor what the instructor has said. What we want always to do in our arguable thesis writing, in our academic writing, is to take ideas the instructor is presenting and then reformulate them on our own using external validation. Notice that before she got there, she was using good jam writing techniques to create a jam outline. What are the possible ideas I could work with? Anna threw away as many ideas as she decided to keep, and this is what good writers do. The reality is we can always come back and write a paper again or write more ideas into our paper. But with a 5-day project, there are some things which, frankly, will have to be tossed out. Other ideas which, for sure, we will want to include. Where will we find those ideas? Jam writing is a great place to start. Then finally, notice that we sat down and we had to create a thesis and points of validation. The question early on, 2 of them. 1, what is our thesis? Clearly stated. 2, what are our topic sentences for our points of validation, and do they relate to our thesis? In other words, if we're working with 3 essays, we want to make sure that those 3 essays are referenced in our topic sentences. We also, of course, are thinking about the kinds of editings that we are going to make on our first draft. Going back to that editing pyramid, we started with draft 1 looking at the main idea. There's no reason to try to study word choice in the first draft. We want to make sure that we understand what was my primary thesis and am I actually writing to that. For example, if Anna hadn't been writing at all the 3 principles of democracy, we would have known this would have been a weak paper. We would have needed to go back and begin reworking. Finally, how we finished. Notice that the editing was very important in terms of getting a number of people to help us with our paper. And notice that we were always making sure that our paper had proper comments. We want criticism, but we want constructive criticism, ways to finish our paper so that we end with power. Finally, presenting our paper in front of the class is a profound way to make sure that we hear, do we sound right as we are presenting our paper. Okay. We have led then you through a research project which starts on day 1 and ends on day 5. Granted, some research projects might take less time, might take more time. But our project here is to always be in control of where we are, to know where we are, to understand through the use of the master schedule, and then to follow that master schedule and thereby finish our project.